In 1967, near the ancient Maya city of Chichén Itzá, a construction crew building an airstrip drove their bulldozer into something that was not dirt. Barely a kilometer from the Great Step Pyramid of El Castillo, they broke open an underground cistern, a sealed chamber called a chultún, connected to a low-ceilinged cave. Inside were the scattered bones of more than 100 children. For decades, those remains sat in a research facility. Scholars assumed the victims were mostly girls, sacrificed to appease rain gods and ensure fertile harvests. That belief appeared in textbooks, museum displays, documentary films. It became a settled fact, repeated so often that no one questioned its foundation. The foundation was a guess. In 2024, a team from the Max Planck Institute and Harvard extracted DNA from 64 of those children. Every single one was genetically male. Not a majority, not a trend, all of them. And among the bones of those boys were 2 pairs of identical twins. That finding did not just correct a detail, it connected a mass burial to one of the oldest creation stories in the Americas, a story about twin boys, sacrifice, and resurrection that the Maya had been telling for more than 2,000 years. But to understand why this matters, and why it took nearly 6 decades to see it, we need to start earlier, with what we thought we knew about the Maya and how deeply we got it wrong. For more than a century, the Maya were understood primarily through their monuments, towering pyramids rising above the jungle canopy, carved stelae recording the conquests and bloodletting rituals of kings, ball courts where rulers enacted cosmic dramas that could end in decapitation. At places like Tikal, Palenque, and Copan, archaeologists spent generations decoding hieroglyphic stairways, excavating royal tombs filled with jade masks, mapping a civilization that independently invented the concept of zero, tracked Venus to within 2 hours of accuracy over 5 centuries, and built cities of 50,000 people in a tropical rainforest with no metal tools, no wheeled vehicles, and no draft animals. The picture that emerged was of a society defined from the top down, and it was catastrophically incomplete. The ordinary Maya, the people who actually built the pyramids, who farmed the milpas, who carried goods through the jungle on their backs using tumplines across their foreheads, were almost invisible. Their houses were made of perishable materials that rotted, their tools decomposed, their stories were never carved in stone. When Michael Coe, the legendary Maya scholar at Yale, summarized the state of the field, he noted that the non-elite population remained essentially unknown, an entire social world inferred from fragments. And when it came to origins, the assumption was straightforward. The Maya developed locally. They were the descendants of the first people to settle Mesoamerica thousands of years earlier, and their civilization grew organically from that local root. Maya languages, Maya genetics, Maya agriculture, all indigenous, all continuous, all flowing from a single ancestral population that had been in the region since the end of the last ice age. This narrative fit the archaeological evidence. It felt complete. It was missing more than half the story. The first crack came not from a lab, but from a painted wall. In 2004, archaeologists from Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History, led by Ramon Carrasco Vargas, were tunneling into a collapsed pyramid mound at Calakmul, one of the largest Maya cities of the Classic period, located deep in the jungle of Campeche State, near Mexico's border with Guatemala. The site had been under investigation since 1993, and it held an estimated 6,750 ancient structures. But what lay inside Structure 1 of the Chichén complex had been hidden for over 1,000 years. The pyramid proved to be an onion, layer after layer of construction, 7 remodelings spanning centuries. The third version, designated Sub 1-4, was exceptional. Its exterior walls were covered in murals, an extremely rare feature in Maya architecture, and the scenes depicted were unlike anything found in the Maya world. Not gods, not kings, not battles, ordinary people, women distributing platters of tamales, a man wearing a broad-brimmed hat ladling maize gruel while another drank from a bowl, a woman carrying ceramic cylinder vessels in a basket on her head, steadied by another woman dressed in fine, transparent blue cloth. Traders, porters, food preparers, all labeled by hieroglyphic captions that the scholars had never seen before. Captions that read, salt person, clay vessel person, maize grain person, tamal person. About 1/3 of the surviving figures were women, a proportion almost unheard of in Maya art. Simon Martin of the University of Pennsylvania Museum, who studied the paintings and their inscriptions, called the find a total shock. Michael Coe of Yale, one of the foremost Maya scholars alive, said there was nothing like it in any known murals. These were people engaged in everyday activities, not the upper crust Maya. And here is the detail that sharpens the irony. The murals were not hidden inside a temple. They were on the outside of the pyramid, facing a public plaza. They were meant to be seen by everyone. The murals had survived because the next generation of builders, instead of smashing the decorated surface as they normally did before constructing overtop, had packed the paintings carefully in a layer of mud and small stones. They chose to preserve them. That decision, made around 1,300 years ago, created a time capsule that the jungle then sealed under centuries of collapse and regrowth. And that capsule changed the question. If the Maya world included a complex social economy of traders, food distributors, and marketplace hierarchies, if this economy was important enough to paint on a public monument in a city of 50,000 people, then the narrow focus on kings and calendars had missed an entire dimension of the civilization. The archaeology had not been wrong about what it found. It had been blind to what it never looked for. But the deepest blindness was not about social class. It was about biology. For decades, the genetic prehistory of Central America remained essentially unexplored. The reason was physical. In the humid tropics, DNA degrades fast. Bones soften, fragment, and eventually dissolve. The molecular traces that allow genome sequencing in colder climates, places like Scandinavia or the Eurasian steppe, where permafrost or dry cave conditions preserve organic material for tens of thousands of years, simply do not last in the heat and moisture of a Guatemalan rainforest. As David Reich of Harvard later noted, part of the gap was preservation. But another part was Eurocentrism, a field that poured resources into European and Asian ancient DNA while treating the Americas as a side project. Researchers knew the tropics were hostile to DNA, and because they knew it, most of them stopped trying. The breakthrough came from a bone that most archaeologists had overlooked. The petrous portion of the temporal bone, that dense wedge of skull just behind the ear, is the hardest bone in the human body. Its internal structure is so tightly mineralized that it creates a natural vault around genetic material, sealing fragments of DNA inside a crystalline matrix that resists degradation even in extreme heat and humidity. In the lab, a petrous bone is ground to powder. Chemical baths strip away millennia of contamination, bacterial DNA, fungal intrusion, the genetic fingerprints of every researcher who touched it. What remains, if anything survives, are fragments of ancient code, readable only by machines sensitive enough to detect a whisper in the noise. Once labs began targeting the petrous specifically, doors that had been locked for decades swung open. In 2022, archaeologist Keith Prüfer of the University of New Mexico and geneticist David Reich of Harvard published a study in Nature Communications that redrew the map of Maya origins from scratch. Since 2014, Prüfer, along with wildlife biologist Said Gutierrez of the Yaakshay Conservation Trust and their colleagues, had been excavating 2 rock shelters on the steep slopes of an old-growth rainforest in the Bladen Nature Reserve in southwestern Belize. The sites lay beneath the overhangs of tall limestone cliffs, a 25-kilometer hike from the nearest road, deep in the Maya Mountains. Those cliffs created something rare in the tropics: shade, dry ground, protection from the rain that destroys everything else. From the dry dirt floors of those shelters, they unearthed more than 85 skeletons, buried in shallow graves spanning nearly 7,000 years. The team directly radiocarbon dated 50 individuals, finding they lived between 1,000 and 9,600 years ago. It was, as Reich later described it, the oldest human DNA from a tropical rainforest site anywhere in the world. If the way these discoveries are being woven together is the kind of deep dive archaeology content you look for, consider subscribing. We have a follow-up in the works that connects this Chichén migration story to new findings about how ancient maize actually changed as it moved north, and it builds directly on what you are about to hear next. Reich's team extracted high-quality ancient DNA from the inner ear bones of 20 of those individuals. They analyzed 1.2 million nucleotide positions across each genome and compared the results to DNA from ancient and modern populations across the Americas. What they found split the timeline of Maya ancestry cleanly in two. The oldest individuals, dating from 9,600 to 7,300 years ago, belonged to an early Holocene lineage with only distant relatedness to present-day Maya. They were not ancestors of the civilization that would build Tikal and Palenque. They were a population with a separate history, one that had entered Central America thousands of years before anyone planted a seed of corn. Then, around 5,600 years ago, the genetic record shifted dramatically. Every single individual tested from after that date carried majority ancestry from a completely different population, one related to present-day Chichén-speaking peoples who live from Costa Rica to northern Colombia. This was not gradual mixing over millennia. It was a major demographic wave moving from south to north. The numbers are stark. More than 50% of modern Maya DNA traces back to this southern migration. Another 20 to 25% comes from the original hunter-gatherer population. The rest derives from highland Mexican ancestors. The Maya, genetically, are not one people with one origin. They are a fusion of at least 3 ancestral lineages, and the largest contributor was a group nobody had detected until 2022. Here is the part that anchors this to something tangible. Carbon isotope analysis from the teeth of the people buried in those same rock shelters showed that before the migration, maize made up only about 10% of the local diet. These were hunter-gatherers who ate wild plants and game, supplementing occasionally with a primitive form of corn. After 5,600 years ago, that number began climbing. By 4,000 years ago, corn was 50% of what these people ate. The shift was not instant. It unfolded over roughly 1,600 years, enough time for new farming methods to take hold, and for the landscape itself to change. Pollen records from the same period show the first clear evidence of forest clearing in the region, the earliest sign that someone was making space to grow food. The migrants did not just arrive with different genes, they arrived with better corn. Maize had originally been domesticated in southwestern Mexico around 9,000 years ago, then dispersed southward to South America, where it was bred into more productive varieties before being carried back north by the Chichén-related peoples. A linguistic analysis conducted by David Moore-Marine of the University of North Carolina found that an early Maya word for maize appears to derive from Chichén, not from any Mesoamerican language family. The term is more phonologically diverse and more widely distributed across Chichén language branches than in any other language group in Central America. The crop and the people who perfected it came from the same direction. This rules out a scenario that archaeologists had long preferred, the idea that farming spread through Central America as an exchange of knowledge between neighboring groups, seeds and techniques passed hand to hand while the populations themselves stayed put. The parallel to Europe is direct. Just as agriculture arrived in Europe with migrating farmers from the Middle East, not simply as an idea, farming in the Maya region arrived with people on the move. The DNA says so. And when they arrived, they eventually became the majority. But the genetic revelations did not stop at origins. They reached into the heart of Maya power itself. Picture two burials, side by side, in the ancient city of Copan. One is a vaulted royal tomb. Inside lies a man surrounded by wealth, two enormous jade pectorals on his chest, one measuring 20 centimeters and the other 24, engraved with symbols of political and military authority. His wealth designation score, a measure archaeologists use to rank burial status, is 5 out of 5, the highest possible. The other burial is right next to it. No tomb, no jade, no offerings of any kind. Wealth score 0. The body's position suggests sacrifice. A king and a victim, separated by inches. For over a century, excavators could describe what they saw, but they could not answer the question that mattered most. Were these two men related? Was this a dynasty sacrificing outsiders, or something stranger? In 2025, Shigeki Nakagome of Trinity College Dublin provided the answer. His team extracted ancient DNA from both individuals, along with 5 others from Copan. The king and the victim shared the same Y chromosome lineage, but they were not close relatives. They belonged to the same patriline without being father and son, or uncle and nephew, or brothers. Ceremonial roles in classic Maya society did not necessarily follow family blood. Power was more fluid, more constructed than the inscriptions on the stelae ever suggested. The broader Copan genomes told a story that mirrored the Belize findings, but at a different scale. About 6% of the genetic ancestry came from highland Mexico, consistent with the founding of Copan's dynasty by Kinich Yax Kukmo in the early 400 CE. The city reached a peak population of roughly 19,000 around 730 CE. Then it collapsed. But, and this is the critical finding, the local Maya ancestry persisted. The population declined but did not disappear. The genetic thread stretching from the late Archaic period through the Classic and into the present day never broke. The Maya did not vanish. Their cities did. Which returns us to those bones at Chichén Itzá. When Rodrigo Barquera of the Max Planck Institute and Christina Warinner of Harvard extracted and sequenced the genomes of 64 sacrificed children from that sealed chultún, the finding that everyone was male did not stand alone. 25% of those boys were close relatives, brothers and cousins from the same extended families. Bone chemistry showed that genetically related children had eaten similar diets, suggesting they had been raised in the same households, or perhaps even prepared specifically for the ritual. The sacrifices spanned 500 years, from approximately 500 to 900 CE, with most burials concentrated in a 200-year window, following what appears to be a ritual calendar rather than reacting to crises like drought. And the twins. 2 pairs of identical twins among those boys. In the Popol Vuh, the Quiché Maya sacred book whose antecedents stretch back more than 2,000 years in murals and ceramics across the Maya world, the hero twins Hunahpu and Xbalanque descend into Xibalba, the underworld, where they endure repeated cycles of sacrifice and resurrection to outwit the gods of death and avenge their murdered father and uncle, who were themselves twins. The chultún, where the children were buried, was itself a subterranean space connected to a cave, exactly the kind of underground chamber the Maya regarded as an entrance to Xibalba. The boys were not randomly selected. They were cast in roles from a story older than the city itself. Spanish colonial accounts had claimed that sacrificial victims at Chichén Itzá were orphans or enslaved captives. The DNA tells a different story. Some boys represented multiple generations of the same family line, suggesting that sacrifice was not punishment or exploitation, but something closer to an honor, reserved for specific kinship networks over centuries. Barquera has noted that no cut marks or evidence of physical trauma were found on the bones, meaning these children were not killed by violence that left skeletal evidence. How they died remains unknown. This is the first archaeological evidence to directly link twin sacrifice to the Popol Vuh narrative. Before DNA, this connection was speculation. Now it is data. What DNA did was something no amount of excavation could accomplish on its own. A bone in the ground is anonymous. It has a location, a stratigraphy, maybe a few associated artifacts. But it cannot tell you whether the person was male or female with certainty when only fragments remain. It cannot tell you whether two individuals were siblings or twins or strangers. It cannot trace the line from a sacrificial victim at Chichén Itzá to a living person in the nearby town of Tixcacaltuyub. DNA can. But there are limits, and they matter. Each of these three studies is a keyhole, sharp and clear but narrow. One pair of rock shelters in Belize, one city in Honduras, one burial chamber on the Yucatan Peninsula. Together, they span 9,000 years and 3 countries, but they leave entire regions unsampled. No ancient DNA exists from the pre-classic Maya centers like El Mirador or Nakbe, where monumental construction predates the classic period by centuries. No genomes have been recovered from the Caribbean coast of Honduras or Nicaragua, the likely corridor for any south to north Chichén movement. And between the latest Belize samples and the earliest Copan burials lies a dark window of over 2,000 years from which no genetic data currently exists. The biggest revelations in Maya genetics came from sites that were, in some sense, accidents. A rock shelter floor that happened to stay dry, a royal tomb where petrous bones happened to survive. The question that keeps the field honest is simple. What would we find if the next accident happened at a site nobody has tested yet? And the mechanism of error deserves one final look. Why did it take until 2022 to discover that the majority of Maya ancestry came from the south? 3 reasons, each compounding the others. First, DNA preservation in the tropics made sampling nearly impossible until the petrous bone technique matured in the mid-2010s. Labs that routinely sequenced Neolithic Europeans had written off Central America as a genetic dead zone. Second, the assumption that farming spread as knowledge rather than as people was so deeply embedded in American archaeology that no one designed a study to test the alternative. The European model, where migrating farmers replaced hunter-gatherers, was well established by the 2010s, but Americanist archaeologists treated the New World as fundamentally different. Farming here was supposed to be a local invention, adopted neighbor to neighbor. Third, the existing genetic research on the Maya focused almost entirely on the classic and post-classic periods, the era of cities and monuments. The deep time window, 9,000 years and older, had never been opened because the right samples from the right sites had never been found. Nobody was looking for a migration that predated Maya civilization by thousands of years. The rock shelters in Belize changed that. Their dry floors, sheltered by limestone overhangs in the Maya mountains, preserved what the jungle elsewhere destroyed. A geological accident, the angle of a cliff, the depth of an overhang, the composition of the soil, created the conditions for a genetic archive that spanned the entire transition from foraging to farming. Some scholars have questioned whether the Chichén migration was a single wave or a slow trickle over many generations. Prüfer has suggested the latter, describing it as small numbers of people moving in over perhaps 500 to 1,000 years and mixing with local populations. Others point out that a migration model built on one site in Belize needs confirmation from elsewhere before it can be extended across the entire Maya lowlands. The counter-argument is straightforward. The genetic signal is not subtle. More than 50% of modern Maya ancestry tracing to one source is not the kind of pattern that appears in a regional outlier and nowhere else. But until someone extracts a genome from the Petén or the Yucatan interior, the debate stays open. Today, more than 6 million people who speak Maya languages live across Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. Their DNA carries all 3 layers of ancestry: the ancient hunter-gatherers, the Chichén migrants, the highland Mexican lineage. When Warinner's team compared the immune genes of the ancient Chichén Itzá children to those of living Maya from Tixcacaltuyub, they found clear differences, evidence that European-introduced diseases after 1492 exerted massive selective pressure, reshaping the immune profile of surviving populations within just a few centuries. The Maya are not a vanished civilization, whose secrets lie buried in the jungle. They are a living people whose bodies carry a genetic manuscript written over 9,000 years, amended by migration, edited by empire, and scarred by conquest. The murals at Calakmul showed us we had been looking at the wrong part of the picture. The DNA showed us we had been reading the wrong chapter entirely. Somewhere in the Maya mountains of Belize, in a rock shelter that takes a full day to hike to, the dirt floor still holds bones that have not been tested. The oldest human DNA from a tropical rainforest came from that site. There is almost certainly more. And if the pattern holds, the next genome sequenced from that floor will carry a story that does not match the one we expect.